Hey everybody, Ethan here from WordTech, back with another video for you guys. So as many of you know, I have a AMD Threadripper 1950X processor. It's a 16-core, 32-thread monster, and I've been recently spending some time playing around with the multitasking capabilities of it, trying to figure out if, in particular, I could do things like game and render, as well as game, render, and stream all at the same time on this. The short answer is, with such a monster processor, yes, you can game and render at the same time. But the long answer is that there's a lot more to it than that, and this is going to be more than one video to cover all of the data that I'm going to be gathering on this subject. So before I actually start getting into the details of this, I wanted to talk about Windows Process Affinity. Now, many of you probably know what that is, but if you don't know what Process Affinity is, I'll go ahead and give you a brief explanation. If you're using Windows and you open up Task Manager, you can go over to the Details tab, and there you have a list of all of your running processes on your computer. And you can click those, right-click one of them, and it'll give you a little drop-down menu, and one of those things is Set Affinity. Affinity, or Process Affinity, is what it's formally called. You use that to set what cores and what threads in specific are being used for, or allowed to be used for that process, which in theory allows you to, allocate certain cores to certain processes, which is something that normally Windows Process Management does completely on its own. But if you have something that's using a lot of power, you might want to allocate a certain number of cores to it. I've done this before, even on like quad-core CPUs, trying to run a render in the background on one core and game on the other 3 cores or something like that, which wasn't the best experience. But that's what Process Affinity is, and that's what all this testing was done with, was moving various tasks around with Process Affinity. So a little bit of a rundown. The 1950X, like I said, is a 16-core, 32-thread monster of a CPU, but it is actually 2 physical CPUs on a PCB. It's 2 physical dies. Each of those dies contains 8 cores and 16 threads, as well as memory controllers, Infinity Fabric to communicate with the other dies, as well as the core complexes and other stuff like that. I won't get into too many details of the architecture, but I want you to keep in mind that there is more than one die there, which I believe skewed the test, not skewed, but showed some interesting results on the testing here. Another important thing to note is exactly how I did this testing. So all the testing that I did here is not particularly formal. It was just testing that I did with Overwatch, viewing the FPS live with my own brain and writing down what I saw, as well as the playability experience of it in terms of how smooth it felt. I will be doing another video on this, likely a slightly longer one, that will have a ton of data for you guys to view in it. And with that data, I plan to capture a ton of data with a ton of games, maybe 3 games, so not a ton of games I should say, but a ton for how long this kind of testing takes. And trying to determine exactly what is happening and what the best experience is, and if you have a high core count CPU, in particular a 1950X, how you should allocate your cores through Process Affinity for doing heavy-duty multitasking like this. So again, it was all done on Overwatch, and in order to do the rendering multitasking, I had Adobe Media Encoder running in the background, which I'll refer to as AME from here on out, and it was running a H.264 transcode to H.264 in 4K, so it's gonna peg the CPU at 100%. I wasn't needing that footage for anything, so I just deleted the extra afterwards, but it was simply to just see what the CPU is like when rendering in order to put it under some kind of load while I'm playing Overwatch. Another important factor is I'm running 32 gigabytes of RAM, but it's only 2 sticks, and it's on the left side of the 1950X in my ASRock X399 Gaming Professional motherboard. Now, I believe I set it up in a dual channel configuration, but anyway, point is, I'm not using all the RAM slots, so I'm not using all of the channels of RAM, which I believe had some kind of effect on the tests here. So the first thing I did is I just wanted to get a baseline of how Overwatch performed with various cores assigned, as well as with various nodes. Now, if you don't know what nodes are, node 0 is one of the physical dies, node 1 is the other physical die. There's 8 cores on each die, again, just to make sure you guys understand that. And one last time, I want to make sure you guys know this was not formal testing, so take this with a grain of salt. I will have formal testing on this later. This is more of an introduction of some interesting things that I found, and I want to go into heavy-duty detail on this to figure out exactly what's happening. So testing Overwatch in and of itself, just playing Overwatch, as well as I had all my normal background stuff running, which to give you an idea of that, my system idles at about 15 gigabytes of RAM usage. I have 50 plus Chrome tabs open at any given time. That's part of why I have the 1950X and why I need more RAM and stuff like that. So there's a lot running in the background, so this is not representative of the performance of the 1950X or the RX 580. Maybe it would be a little bit in like a real world scenario, since you will have stuff running in the background in the real world, but that's not the point of this video. So Overwatch running on 16 cores, ranged from about 140 to 160 FPS, completely smooth, no problems there. Overwatch running on 8 cores on node 0, again, that's one of the physical dies in there, ran at about 130 to 150 FPS, completely smooth. Overwatch on 4 cores on node 0 ran at about 90 to 120 FPS, so we're going a little lower each time here, but still completely smooth, completely playable. Higher frame rates are nicer for something like Overwatch, but nothing that's a huge deal. Overwatch running on 2 cores was 60 to 90 FPS on node 0, once again, with the occasional stutter. It wasn't unplayable, it was in fact playable enough. I'd probably be willing to use it for competitive, although I'd prefer higher frame rate, but 60 to 90 FPS, it was, it was usable. It was just occasionally stuttering. Overwatch on 1 core on node 0, less than 30 FPS, completely stuttery mess, unplayable, would not recommend at all. Now, another important thing to note is each of these tests that I'm running with the cores, it is a hyper-threaded environment, or a simultaneous multi-threaded environment, to be more proper and use the proper architecture terms. So 8 cores testing was done on 16 threads, 4 cores testing was done on 8 threads, just so that you guys are aware of exactly how that's happening. So I decided to do the same Overwatch tests, obviously not the 16 core again, but I want to do the same ones, the 8, the 4, the 2, and the 1, over on node 1, just to see what the performance was like, if there was any difference between the 2 physical dies. And there was. A lot more than I expected. Now again, these aren't super formal this wasn't super formal, these weren't on the same map or with the same people necessarily, but the difference is so big, I don't think that accounts for very much of this. So Overwatch running on 8 cores on node 1, we were looking at 150 to 210 FPS, completely smooth. That is 50 to 60 FPS higher from my visual, viewpoint of watching the FPS counter, than doing the same thing on node 0. Very interesting there. Now Overwatch on 4 cores on node 1 ran from 130 to 165 FPS, again completely smooth. Overwatch on 2 cores ran from 90 to 130 FPS. That I'd be willing to use for competitive. Completely smooth, no stuttering on that one either. But you drop it down to 1 core again, so again 1 core, 2 threads, 60 FPS, right? Doesn't sound too bad. It was unplayable, completely stuttery, it was just a mess. It just did not function very well. Overwatch doesn't like to run on just on one core from my testing here. Of course, this wasn't super formal, but it doesn't run very well on a single core. So now we get into the testing with Adobe Media Encoder, and this is where things get more interesting, is being able to do the heavy-duty multitasking that I was talking about. So all 16 cores assigned to both Overwatch and AME. Complete mess playing Overwatch, as you'd expect. Windows Process Management does not understand how to prioritize the game. Even if you set the game to highest priority, real time, and you set AME to the lowest priority, the game's still completely unplayable. It's just not realistic. Windows Process Management just can't do that good of a job of handling that. So I'm not going to test 16 cores again between the two. So we dropped down to 8 cores for Overwatch on node 0. Again, that was the worst performing node when testing Overwatch alone, and we had 8 cores on node 1 for AME. We were getting 50 to 65 FPS. It was playable, but there was pretty bad stuttering. The FPS was high enough. It wasn't complete garbage, but it's definitely not something that I'd enjoy, and I would 100% would not use it for a competitive environment. So now we're swapping nodes here, because as you can see, the testing, it was pretty bad experience playing like that, and so I didn't test 4 cores, 2 cores, and 1 core in that configuration with Overwatch on node 1, on node 0, because as we know, Overwatch performs better on node 1 anyway, and so I didn't want to do testing because it was already not something I'd recommend. So moving over to Overwatch 8 cores on node 1 and AME, Adobe Media Encoder, 8 cores on node 0, things changed a lot. We saw 70 to 90 FPS, completely playable, very occasional stutters, but nothing that was like super bothersome by any means. Just a little bit of stuttering, enough that I would use it for a competitive environment. Then we move Overwatch to 4 cores, but we still have on node 1, but we still have AME running with 8 cores on node 0, about 60 to 80 FPS, so about 10 FPS lower on average, and a little bit stuttery, a little bit slower than I'd like. It didn't really feel much worse than playing on 8 cores though, which makes sense because as far as any testing I've done, Overwatch doesn't really take advantage of more than 4 cores very well. So, you know, it makes sense that you're getting very similar FPS results and very similar stuttering results. But again, 4 cores or 8 cores in this situation would be totally playable and even usable in a competitive environment. So, Overwatch on 2 cores on node 1 and AME on 8 cores on node 0, you're getting 35 to 50 FPS, barely playable, still hardly any stuttering. That's what's so interesting is when Overwatch is on node 1, I experience virtually 0 stuttering across the board, like almost none. Very interesting the way that works, but it's still too low of FPS to be realistic. Now, these are running on medium to high settings, more like the high range of settings for Overwatch, so you could probably lower the settings and get substantially better frame rates, so it maybe could be usable. But you may be asking, well, why for each of those tests was I running AME just on the 8 cores, just basically giving it node 0, and then Overwatch I was changing the core count on node 1? What was the reasoning behind that? Well, this next test shows the reasoning behind that. So when I decided to finally see how, basically how Overwatch running on 4 cores on node 1 and AME running on 9 cores, so all of node 0 and 1 core from node 1, doing this test immediately tanked things to completely unplayable. So I was getting 50 to 70 FPS, doesn't sound too terrible. The stuttering was so bad, I wouldn't want to use it for something like Civilization. It was that bad of stuttering. It wasn't just, oh, well, it's a first-person shooter, you can't really have hardly any stuttering or it's bad. No, it was bad. I wouldn't want to play any game at the level of stuttering that I was getting in that configuration. That is very interesting to me to see that giving Adobe Media Encoder just 1 core over on the other node, so it's communicating across nodes, and all of a sudden Overwatch performance just tanks into the ground, just completely unplayable. That was really interesting to me. Of course, now I can run something like Adobe Media Encoder on 15 cores, giving 2 threads, 1 core to the rest of my system. I mean, obviously Windows Process Management moves things around, so some of the other cores that are doing Adobe stuff are also managing other things, but I can browse the web, generally even watch footage. 4K sometimes is a little bit iffy. I like to use 2 cores. Generally, that's what I do is I assign 14 cores to the Adobe Media Encoder or Premiere Pro when I'm rendering, and the other 2 I just use for doing whatever I want to do on my computer. But it's really interesting for me to be able to see that if I want to game and render at the same time, I need to only assign a single node to Premiere Pro or Adobe Media Encoder or whatever's rendering, doing encoding and stuff like that. Preferably, in my current configuration, node 0 for the rendering and the like. Now, I believe the crazy stuttering that's occurring there, the difference in performance as well as stuttering that's occurring between nodes for Overwatch, I think might be related to the way my RAM is configured and which node the 2 channels of RAM are communicating to. Because if it's having to go across node with that information, especially considering how RAM intensive rendering and transcoding is, I can understand why that might use up, cause significant issues because the Infinity Fabric's probably being loaded to the max at that point. So I do want to do this testing in the future when RAM prices come down a little bit. I plan to fill this thing up with 128 gigs. I'm going to do this testing again, and then I'll be able to see if it really was a cross node thing or if it was just a RAM thing. I do, however, believe that having Adobe Media Encoder use just that extra core on node 1 and all of node 0, or just giving it even 1 thread, it doesn't even have to be a whole core, just 1 thread, tanks Overwatch's performance. That, I believe, is due to inter-die communication and is not due to clock speeds and other weird stuff like that. I believe that's latency problems happening because of inter-die communication through Infinity Fabric. This is all really interesting to me. Now, back when I had my, I still have it, but my 6700K and my Sega laptop, I would attempt to do the same thing as play Overwatch and render at the same time. I give Overwatch 3 cores, so 6 threads, and 2 threads would go to Adobe Media Encoder, Premiere Pro, etc. And it was completely playable, but it didn't seem to matter which configuration I did it in. So I do believe that the Infinity Fabric is actually having an effect on this, but I'm not 100% sure there because, again, I don't have all my channels of RAM filled up, so that's more testing that I'll have to do. So I'm going to be doing some more formal testing on this in this particular configuration with the 32 gigabytes of RAM. I'll be doing some more formal testing and presenting a video to you guys about that in the future. I don't know exactly how long that'll take because this kind of stuff, we like to run 5 test runs for each one, so it's going to take significant time to get all of this done. But I will be having a video out at some point investigating process Affinity and Threadripper more intensively so that you guys know the actual graphs and everything of the data here so that we can figure out exactly what's happening. And what I'll probably do is try and move my RAM to different slots that are potentially connected to a different node and see if then all of a sudden node 0 is the one that performs better over node 1 for Overwatch. Because if that's the case, then we can eliminate the fact, we can eliminate it being Infinity Fabric in and of itself, and maybe more so a Infinity Fabric being bogged down because Adobe Media Encoder is having to grab data from RAM and do heavy reads and writes on RAM across the Infinity Fabric because it's a cross-die configuration. So I know that was kind of a long video for you guys, but I wanted to make sure I got everything out there. I spent a lot of time doing just some rough testing on this because I wanted to get an idea of how I wanted to formulate the more formal test. So anyway, that's pretty much it for you guys, but my recommendation for now, until I have more formal testing, is if you have a 1950X and you want to game and render at the same time, assign one of the nodes, and in my configuration at least, node 1 to the game and the other node to whatever rendering you're doing. Let Windows Process Management do all the other background stuff, just your game and your rendering or transcoding. Another thing that I will be testing with this, it's going to take more time, but this wasn't something that I tested with very formally at all. This was just something I fiddled around with, was doing Overwatch, trying to stream it and record it as well as render at the same time. And it was possible. In fact, it seemed to be possible to have node 1 handling 4 cores for Overwatch, 4 cores for streaming and recording, and then all of node 0 was doing the rendering in the background. But again, I don't have formal testing on that. I played around with it for just a few minutes. Things seemed pretty smooth. It seemed doable, although the frame rate was a little lower than I'd like on Overwatch, if I remember correctly. It was below 60, so it wasn't something I prefer for a FPS type game. But I will for sure be including that in the testing too, to see if it's possible with such a powerful CPU. Can you game and render and stream all at the same time and, you know, watch a video or whatever you may want to do? Anyway, everybody, thank you for watching. That's it for this one. Don't forget to check out all the links in the description down there. We've got links down there to social media, our website, our forums, our Patreon page. So if you're interested in giving a monthly contribution, the Patreon page is down there. Obviously, don't forget to like and subscribe and leave a comment to let me know what you think of my findings, as well as let me know if you're excited for the future findings on this, because I am doing a deep dive into Process Affinity, and I'll probably be doing a write-up on the website about it with even more detail than the video will end up having. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.